I think for more educated young adults who have gotten that college degree,
right.
the bigger challenge for them is recognizing that the most important thing for them is not the extra degree or the perfect career. It's, are you moving forward when it comes to love, marriage, and family?
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, David Mahan, and joined in person today by Dr. Brad Wilcox from the Institute for Family Studies and a professor at the University of Virginia. He is one of the authors of our new Hope in a Future report, and we're excited to have him in person in Columbus. My only regret is that you got to spend a lot of time with Aaron and David while you're here, Brad.
Hard yoke to bear, being around us all day. But, yeah.
But you're in town to talk about the report, and we're grateful to have you here on the podcast. So if I can, just start us off with what is the Hope in the Future report, and what does your research show?
Yeah, so we began this report by kind of reflecting on the state of the American dream, kind of in general in the U.S. and then in Ohio in particular. And I think one of the kind of key takeaways is that, in some important respects, the American dream here in Ohio is in trouble. What we see basically in the report is that unfortunately the state is number 3 when it comes to deaths of despair. That's like deaths related to suicide and drug overdoses and things like that. 70% of kids across the state are poor, which puts you, unfortunately, in the kind of the top third for child poverty across America. Then when it comes to reports of hope, we see that, Ohio is in the bottom quintile for hope in a recent study. So we're kind of, I think, underlining is that there's some points of concern, here in Ohio, in the Buckeye State, and we think a lot of those concerns can be traced back to the fact that the family is more fragile here in Ohio than it is in other states. We see that about 48% of kids in this state are being raised in intact married families, which is below the national average of 53%. And so, again, the idea here is that we could talk about a lot of things, but in terms of just kind of one key indicator of family strength, we're just seeing here in Ohio that, a majority of kids, to put it another way, in the state are not being raised by their own married parents. And, I think from our perspective in this new report, that's a big reason why a lot of the other indicators in the state aren't looking great. So we're, I think, trying to think about ways from a policy-based perspective, but also from the perspective of civil society to think about steps the state can take to kind of boost its standing in what we call a new family structure index, which is 29 for Ohio, up through measures to strengthen marriage and family life across the Buckeye State.
Well, Aaron, I don't often ask you questions on the podcast, but I think it's important here because you didn't get to join the live stream last week. You were near a pool or something on the beach. I forget exactly where you were.
I was with Brad. He actually jumped on the podcast, though. I was stuck in traffic.
Like that.
Yeah, But why is CCV getting involved in marriage and family? That seems like it could be beyond what we normally do, but explain the rationale for CCV commissioning this report and now promoting it.
Yeah, I think a few different reasons. We've obviously talked before about, especially after the abortion initiative, how important marriage is to saving lives, and that's something I think J.D. Vance has been really good on. But honestly, that's almost secondary to a broader conversation that I've really been convicted on for a long time, and that's just we spend so much of our time at the State House trying to deal with what I think is the fallout from everything Brad just sort of gave a high level over, right? Our schools aren't doing what they need to do. We've got we have a lot of crime going on in our inner cities. We have an opioid epidemic, a drug epidemic, that kind of stuff. So many of the things that we kind of grit our teeth over in politics today all come back to the fallout of bad choices being made, bad decisions being made, and that's the hard thing about this from a public policy perspective is that the real fix to something like this is people making better personal decisions, right? But there are things that government can do to encourage those things, right? Encourage making better decisions, and so it just felt like I'll just speak about from the broader sort of Christian conservative engagement side. Our standard line for a lot of groups like CCV, when you say, hey, what issues do you work on? It's life, marriage and family, and religious freedom. Well, to be blunt, a lot of times our marriage and family platform amounted to we oppose same-sex marriage, and that's true for CCV. We do, but the importance of marriage and family is far greater than just that. And I think what this report shows is it actually is a massive economic driver. It's much bigger than just some moral issue that we talk about.
Yeah, and Brad, so as we get into some of the research and the data, what do we see in that connection between marriage and families and some of the societal issues that Aaron mentions?
So from kind of like the 10,000 foot level, what we see in kind of a lot of national research is that oftentimes kind of the strength of families is the most important predictor of things like the health of the American dream. So work done by Raj Chetty at Harvard, for instance, tells us that communities that have stronger two-parent families have way more mobility for poor kids. They're way more likely to kind of reach affluence as adults if they're growing up in communities where there are lots of two-parent families surrounding them. So I think here in Ohio, like Holmes County, for instance, is way more likely to promote mobility for poor kids than other counties in the state with more single-parent families. So that's kind of one example of kind of the national story. But then kind of more concretely in terms of what we're seeing in Ohio is that we're seeing that kids, for instance, being raised in single-mother households are 4 times more likely to be poor compared to kids being raised in married parent households, even controlling for factors like race and education on the part of their parents. So it's kind of one example of the way in which when kind of the family is more fragile here across the Buckeye State, kids are more likely to experience poverty, and that has obvious implications for their capacity to succeed in school. It has implications for how much money the state's going to spend on Medicaid to help support their health care. And then also it has implications down the road oftentimes too for their odds of running afoul with, the police and then ending up incarcerated and in prison or in jail here in the state as well. So there's just a whole host of ways that we see kind of both in the national data, but also in the data that we have here in the Hope and Future report, that when kids are being raised in fragile families, they're more likely to be struggling here in Ohio.
I want to just jump on real quick that Holmes County point he just made. Because especially for our Ohio listeners, your mind might just jump to, well, Holmes County is such an outlier because it's such a big Amish population, right? And
some of us here were born in Holmes County. Exactly, I would just like choose your words carefully, sir.
Mike shaved off his chin strap on the way in this morning. Now, what I actually love about that Holmes County picture is it shows the impact of culture on these things, right? How culture shapes the well-being of kids and the economic impact on the state, right? This is where we try to build these artificial silos of how we look at, there's cultural issues and there's economic issues and there's all these different things. But again, you look at Holmes County, I think for a lot of folks, nobody would really look at Holmes County as a particularly wealthy county. But it's a county that's doing well because they have strong families, right? And so it's not just about the sort of economic drivers that allow a county like that to thrive in terms of, do they have massive industry or big headquartered businesses there? But they just have really strong families, and that's where the culture piece of this matters so much.
And this is not just even about economy, right? I mean, what is it about strong families where fathers, right, more specifically, fathers in the home, what makes them the superhero in this story, right? Because, I mean, without fathers in the home, we know 7 times more likely to become teen pregnant, experience a teen pregnancy, 2 times greater risk of infant mortality, you've got the prison piece, academic performance. What is so important about the father role in the home?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And what we see kind of in the broader research, as you were just kind of, I think, indicating, is that kids are much more likely to be flourishing in families where their married father is in the home, where mom and dad are together. One other thing that kind of struck me when I wrote my book, Get Married, for last year for HarperCollins, is that this is like my most striking finding for the kids kind of data, is that young men today in America are more likely to land in prison or in jail than they are to graduate from college if they're from any kind of non-intact family, without their mom and dad at home. Wow. And by contrast, young men who are, coming from an intact married family are about 4 times more likely to graduate from college than they are to spend any time in prison or in jail. So it just kind of illustrates the statistical kind of, story that you were just telling us. But in terms of the why, I would say a couple of things. Number one, I mean, we can kind of minimize the idea that, that men's breadwinning matters, in this more contemporary era that we're living in, but it still matters, right? I mean, raising kids is expensive, talking about food today, super expensive to pay for groceries. We're talking obviously about housing today. We're talking about, unfortunately, oftentimes travel sports. I mean, you can just, obviously kids are expensive, right? And so if you have a father in the home who's dedicated to working hard to support his family financially, that matters. Okay, that's part of the answer. But we know that dads matter in ways that go beyond obviously their financial contributions.
Right, because just because you're poor doesn't mean you're criminal.
Correct. And on that score, what we see is that dads play an important role when it comes to challenging their kids to embrace life's opportunities and also to face life's difficulties. One study actually comes from France, looking at how moms and dads in the pool with their toddlers were kind of like helping them learn to swim. And what moms did in the pool overwhelmingly was to kind of hold the toddler eye to eye. Okay. What dads often would do in the pool was turn them around and kind of like, have them face we call it Duke and Altum, out into the deep, in the water, And this is kind of it's a great kind of example of the way in which dads, just parent their kids differently on average than moms do. They're more likely to sort of expect independence on their part and to kind of encourage them to take risks. And that's good for our kids, obviously. When it comes to discipline, it's actually the case that moms, even in an intact home, discipline their kids more than dads because they spend more time, with their kids, even obviously in 2025. But what's interesting is there's a different approach to discipline. Dads are much less flexible. They're much more kind of rule-based. And they're more likely to kind of assert their authority with their kids in kind of a strong way. And it's good for our kids to be exposed both to that kind of more paternal style discipline. I mean, there's some contexts, like if you're, pulled over on the highway by a state police officer, you kind of need to know how to handle that kind of discipline or authority. Or if you're in the military, obviously, serving in the military, for instance, would be another example. Moms are more likely to kind of tailor their discipline to kind of the situation, to kind of be responsive to the kids' needs and concerns, and that's good too for kids to
weakness.
No.
Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying viva la difference, right? We have to understand and appreciate that our kids benefit from both the maternal and the paternal approach to discipline.
For sure.
So that's another kind of piece that we see in the research. And then I think too, when it comes just to kind of the power of physical play. We're just kind of learning more and more about the ways in which our kids really benefit from that kind of exciting physical play with their father. Whether it's a toddler kind of rolling around on the fin room floor, playing horsey or wrestling with dad, or whether it's the teenage, son, throwing the basketball, in the driveway, or maybe dad helping his teenage daughter kind of learn how to play volleyball. This kind of physical play is really important. It's good for our kids. We know, for instance, that kids who roughhouse with their dads are more likely to be flourishing in school. They're more socially popular. And we think kind of like what they're learning from their father is that, some kinds of like physical interaction are fine, but other kinds like biting, for instance, your dad is not acceptable. And they're kind of just learning how to handle their bodies, in ways that are helpful to them. So anyways, the point simply is that there are just a number of ways in which dads play an important role in their kids' lives. And so what both kids here in Ohio and the kids across the country benefit from typically is having their dad, in the home day in and day out. That's the kind of story.
Now David doesn't feel so bad about having such a bad back. Is that you raised 4 kids successfully? That's a badge of honor, David. That you got to keep going to the chiropractor.
I thought you were going to talk about my biting habit. I was scared.
Yeah, stop biting lawmakers, David. Just as an aside, that's something you should not be doing. Exactly.
His desk is just a mess downstairs.
Exactly. Yeah, it really
like a toddler teething in there.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Well, Brad, one question we got on the live stream or version of it last week has to do with correlation and causation. And I know we can get in the weeds a little bit when we get into data when we talk about that, but how can we see that these two things are related in a way that changing the strength of family is going to have an impact on those other societal issues like poverty and education and those types of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's no doubt, I think from a sociological perspective, that factors like race and factors like poverty are implicated in the strength and stability of families both across the country and here in Ohio. So I want to kind of minimize this idea that, kind of just snap our fingers and have everyone kind of just leap into marriage, for instance, or leap into the success sequence, kind of that more later, without any assistance or, encouragement. There's a role for kind of civil society and for public policy to help folks who have been disadvantaged growing up in ways that make their ability to kind of enter into adulthood, more successful. But at the same time, I think we need to tell, both the state and our young adults and kids the truth, which is that there is a pathway towards realizing the American dream, in America and in Ohio in particular. And that pathway runs through, some kind of education, some kind of full-time work, and getting typically married before having any children. And if you kind of, follow that what we call the success sequence, that education, work, and marriage, you're much more likely to realize the American dream. Only 3% of young adults who follow that sequence end up poor. You're more likely to be in the middle class or higher. And in terms of the correlation versus causation piece, when it comes to that particular question, we're just beginning to kind of develop more sophisticated methodologies, Mike, that allow us to sort of make the causal claims, I think, more forcefully and strongly. Mm-hmm. So we're having twin studies now, for instance, and other more sophisticated econometric studies that kind of tell us how, in this case, for instance, like marriage is causally related to the outcomes we're talking about today. But let me just give you kind of two examples of what I'm talking about. So the first is that there was a twin study done in Minnesota of men, and what they found was that identical twin guys who were married earned about 26% more than their identical twin brothers who were not married. Okay, so it's kind of stronger evidence of something about marriage per se, even kind of factoring in genetic factors, being raised in the same home, and having roughly similar backgrounds, as identical twins tend to have. And yet it's the identical twins who are married who are, doing much better when it comes to the workplace, in this case for men. It's one example. There's a different study done by an MIT economist, Jonathan Gruber, who's, center-left guy, just looking at the effect of the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And so what he finds is that kids who are raised in states where no-fault divorce was the law were much more likely to struggle later in life, I think both, educationally and economically, than kids who are raised in states where the divorce law was more along the kind of traditional lines, where kind of marriage had more kind of legal power in the lives of those families and kids. So it's a pretty powerful kind of way of kind of showing us that when marriage, as an institution is stronger, when it kind of grounds and guides more of people's lives in a given state, the kids who grow up in that kind of, legal regime tend to do better. So, there are other studies, but, I think it's just important to understand and appreciate that, a bunch of things influence where kids and adults, land in life, how they do in life, how they're situated emotionally in life. But we are kind of getting more and more evidence that's pretty sophisticated that tells us that marriage as an institution is really helpful for our kids and for our adults, both across the country. And then I'd say our new report too, we do control for things like race and education, looking at all these outcomes, and still find again that kids in Ohio who are being raised in stable married families are doing better.
So, Brad, I really want to unpack what's at the center of this report, quite literally, the Family Structure Index. Can you explain a little bit about it? And then I actually want to take the three components of it and talk those things through. But can you just explain big picture what the Family Structure Index is?
So when we did this report, Aaron challenged me and Nick Zill, the psychologist who helped, do a lot of the empirical research for this project, to think about kind of developing a family index that would kind of allow us to rank different states across the U.S. And so I'm grateful to Aaron for that challenge. And, as Nick and I kind of thought about this challenge, we thought about kind of what are kind of like the three best indicators of strong families in states across the U.S. And from our perspective, given the fact that marriage in America and fertility in America are kind of in decline right now, and given the fact that kids are way more likely to flourish when they're raised in stable married families, we thought the kind of best way to develop a measure or an index of family strength across the U.S. is to measure the share of prime-aged adults who are married the fertility rate of, a given state, and the share of kids who are being raised in stable married families across their childhood in this new report. And so we kind of combine those three indicators into an index where they're equally weighted, and then generated this, measure of which states are number 1, which states are number 50, and in this case, which state's number 29, which is Ohio.
It's Ohio. And I think, from my perspective on this, what's helpful about this is when we're talking about marriage and family, so much of it comes back to culture. So it's really hard to say how. It's the hardest thing whenever we talk about culture here at CCV, because you can't measure, is the culture one Chuck Colson unit more of righteous or whatever you want to call that, right? Like, how are you actually measuring how you're shifting culture? And I think the index gives us that. And what I think is also good about the index is it's, a lot of folks release various state rankings that tend to be based, especially in the public policy space, they tend to be based on what laws do you have on the books, right? And a lot of times that can be a really good indicator of how the state's doing economically, right? Or how the state's doing on whatever issue, like, Americans United for Life does their life list. But all of that is just measuring what laws are on the books, not what's the actual impact of those laws, right? Or the actual impact of the culture. And so this, by going with these more sort of demographic related indicators, you actually get a better sense and can see, from CCV's perspective, we want to see this year in, year out. Are we actually moving forward, right? And how can we tell if we're moving, actually making a difference here on these things? I want to kind of unpack those individual elements, the three components that go into it. So first off, the percentage of adults aged 25 to 54 in the state who are married, kind of the way you describe it is prime aged adults. And again, Ohio is ranked 31st in prime aged adults. Only 56% of our adults in Ohio in their prime age are married. What do you think's driving such a low, maybe not just in Ohio in particular, but just generally a decrease in prime age adults who are married?
So I think that this is obviously there's a lot of factors driving this sort of decline in marriage. It's a big part of my book, Get Married, kind of talking about what's driving all this. And I think part of the story here is that we have kind of moved in recent years towards a more individualistic mindset where we're kind of deprioritizing, dating, marriage, and family life. And so people are kind of focusing on what, either they want to do with their lives or on their careers or, their education, and not so much on kind of like, dating, getting married, and starting a family. And so that's kind of a national trend, national challenge. We're living obviously in a more secular context as well, and we know that religion tends to promote marriage. So I think that's part of the story here as well. But there's also kind of like a class-based issue here where marriage has kind of been retreating much more quickly among Americans who don't have a college degree than it has been for Americans who do have that college degree. And I think part of the story here is that we're seeing, particularly for working class men, a major increase in the number of, or the share of working class men who are not working full time. So in my book, I talk about the fact that what we're seeing now is about 1 in 4, prime age working class men are not employed full time. What that means for marriage is they're less likely to get married in the first place, because even today, women still prefer to marry guys who are employed full time, who've got decent jobs, and then also they're much more likely to get divorced, because women are much more likely to divorce their husbands if they're not employed, full time. So I think, part of the story when it comes to Ohio is that because you have a larger working class population, and we've seen more greater detachment between full-time work and men in working class communities. That's probably part of the story here in Ohio. There's also obviously been a lot of economic shifts in the state of late, away from a kind of strong manufacturing base, and that's also, I think, playing a role too in understanding why Ohio is below average when it comes to both marriage and when it comes to family stability. But all three of you are, to be honest, more experts in Ohio than I am. So let me just turn the question around on you, Aaron, to say, why do you think, what is it about Ohio that puts both your marriage rate and your family stability rate below the national average? Like,
actually, I want to hear David on this first, because I got a few thoughts. But I honestly, as Brad, as you were describing that, I think that's going to be our next challenge, is kind of taking your book, because you unpack in your book both the four masters of marriage, the four classes of masters of marriage, but then also what are the sort of the 5 C's around why people aren't getting married. And it would be really interesting. I don't think we have yet taken that and said, okay, so where does Ohio fall? And I've got some thoughts there of why our marriage rate amongst prime-age adults is down. But I don't know, David or Mike, if you guys have specific thoughts to that end.
I think it's selfishness. I mean, this has just been amazing to see all these numbers come together. The top of the list, we have Utah, right? And we know that's Mormon, culture out there, very high focus and weight on family. You mentioned Holmes County, Amish, right?
And Geauga County is the other county in Ohio that really stands out.
Yeah.
Geauga, sorry.
Listen, in Ohio, we pronounce vowels that aren't even there. That's the names of our towns.
So Holmes and Geauga are the top 2 counties, I think, in Ohio for family stability. And that, of course, once again, is your point.
And I think culturally, we've just moved away from that. But you said something during our live stream that, kind of stuck with me. And you said that this marriage thing can be contentious, right? It can be controversial.
Sure.
And I kind of put that back to you, like, why, right? And because we've got both political parties at the top of their ticket. On one side you've got Vance speaking out very strongly on marriage and family. On the other side you've got Obama, former President Obama. And he was even more specific than Vance. This is what he said. Of all rocks upon which we build our lives, we are reminded today that family is the most important. And we are called to recognize and honor how critical every father is to that foundation. And he goes even deeper. But if we are honest, and I think that's the key here, we just need to be honest, not politically correct, but honest with ourselves. We'll all admit that too many fathers are missing, right? And they're missing from the lives of their children in their homes. You and I know how true this is in the African American community. We know that more than half of all black children live in single-parent households, a number that has doubled, and he repeats it. He said doubled since we were children, right? And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. I want to quote one more, even more important person, and that's the Lord, that's God himself. Jeremiah 29:11 is where we get the title of this report, Hope in the Future, right? And it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope in the future." That's where we got the whole foundation of this thing. Well, what is that plan? Well, then you just got to go back a little bit in the chapter. 29:4, it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Listen, here's the plan. "Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens," right? Work and eat what you produce. "Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters." Listen, increase in number there, right? I think the report said that we've had an 11% decrease in fertility rate here in the state of Ohio, right? And we know that that's probably got something to do with the abortion issue as well. Also, "Seek the peace and prosperity of the city which I've carried you into exile. Pray for it, because if it prospers, you too shall prosper." Clearly, right? We've got the Lord, we've got Obama, we've got Vance, all saying that the key to prosperity is marriage and family.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think David's zeroing in on a couple things when I diagnose why Ohio is falling back here. I think first and foremost, we're not. A lot of this goes back to the public schools for me, where you have in Ohio 80% of our kids going through government schools, and whether it's public schools or our higher education system, and we have way more universities in Ohio than we know what to do with. Right, we have 13 state universities, 11 public colleges, and then probably double that in private universities. But especially at our public universities, the next generation is taught that what the good life looks like is complete autonomy, and sort of maximize materialism, right? That's to me, that's the cultural side of this. I was impressed by this when I lived in Arizona, and I interacted with more Mormons than I'd ever had. They did a better job of sort of capturing the social imagination of the next generation, that this is the goodness of life, right? To David's point in Jeremiah there, like, this is what life is about, right? Get married, have kids, like that's the richness there, right? And I don't know if I've talked about this on the podcast, but I talk about this a lot now, is, with what we do at CCV, we get the blessing of interacting with some of the most successful people in politics and business, in what we do. And almost to a person, when you sit down with them over coffee or lunch and you say, how you doing? The first thing they start talking about is their kids or grandkids, right? It's the thing that brings them the most joy in life. And that's not the picture that's taught to kids. So I think that's a big part of it. I do think, though, Brad, the other thing that you brought up, that I'm seeing more and more is, we don't, I don't want to say we don't value our young men, but our society is not built around helping young men thrive and succeed, right? And so that, I think that has two effects, that you've documented really well. I think, on the one hand, it makes their job prospects, and their opportunities to really provide really decrease. And again, I would throw everything. This is not just about what our education system. This is everything from technology to porn to video games, all that kind of stuff. But it also makes them less marriageable. And we've talked about that here on the podcast before. But just looking at Ohio, I think those two aspects of this, especially looking at the marriage rate of why only 55%, because again, I think about the first time I ever heard David talk was actually on a world radio interview that Maria did with him, where David would go into these schools and teach the success sequence, and the first question he would ask is, how many of you guys want to own a home and
great marriage and family,
have a great marriage, and every hand would go up, right? But
no matter where I was,
exactly, and that's not the case, or that they don't ever get to actually realize that, right? In a lot of cases anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that what I call the male malaise in some of my work is just, got to be part and parcel of this. Again, you all know here what's happening on the ground in Ohio, but we're just seeing, too many young men. I mean, it's gaming, it's gaming as school-age kids, and, maybe pornography as well as they get older. Just kind of sort of basically corrodes their capacity to have, social skills, interactions, to develop hobbies that would be interesting, to kind of have a hunger for some kind of educational or professional goal. And then also maybe kind of also minimizes their interest in kind of dating real girls or later real women. And then all this makes them less marriageable as they head into their, into their 20s. So this is obviously a challenge that is facing not just Ohio, but it's facing the country as a whole. But it could be part and parcel of why the state has a below average, share of prime-aged adults who are married. And again, I think we have actually done a lot of things, including Ohio, to kind of look at the social media challenge facing our adolescents, and that's great. And there's more that can be done even on that score, as you well know, everyone here. But we haven't tackled the technological challenges facing our teenage boys. And so, and this actually, there's a chapter in Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, on the boy question, boy challenge. And he's saying, look, we understand social media is bad for our girls. Well, guess what, gentlemen and ladies? Our gaming, issue is really bad for our teenage boys. It really kind of, basically, kind of really incapacitates them, when it comes to their schooling and their life more generally. And so I think we also need, from a policy perspective, to begin to think about measures to try to reduce the power and the reach of gaming and pornography in our kids' lives, especially our teenage boys' lives.
Aaron mentioned, that, okay, one of the problems is that there's this lust after materialism, that if I don't get married, if I just pursue my education, I get a good career, and I don't have kids, and I'm going to be more prosperous than if I would have done what we're all talking about doing today.
Right.
Why are they wrong? right? Because we've talked about marriage and family,
right. So I think, and I think here there are really two different, in some ways, sets of challenges. If we were to kind of break, the population kind of roughly into halves for young adults. I mean, the young adults who are kind of, not on the kind of college track, I think they're more likely to be struggling with, some issues around, trust and relationship drama, and young men who are not employed on a full-time basis. These are some of the challenges that are kind of really more salient for working class, Americans and Buckeye, residents. I think for more educated young adults who have gotten that college degree, right, the bigger challenge for them is recognizing that the most important thing for them is not, the extra degree or the perfect career. It's, are you moving forward when it comes to love, marriage, and family? And I talk about this in terms of like a Midas mindset that we see among a lot of young adults in that more educated arena, where they think, their education, their money, especially their career, building their own brand individually, that's the path to building a meaningful and happy life. What they don't understand and appreciate is that, in fact, being a good friend, being a good boyfriend, girlfriend, then being a good husband, wife, and being a good parent, that these social relationships are much more important when it comes to building a meaningful and happy life. And we see in my data that young adults who are married, that factor, kind of the marriage factor, boosts happiness more than, a satisfying career or a good education or an above average income. And that nothing in my data matters more for predicting happiness across the entire population, but it's relevant, I think, for the college educated set and educated set, matters more than a high quality marriage. So again, I think we have to help our
So married couples make more money over the course of their lifetime.
Well, so they have as a household, that's right. And then they have both, for men and women, they've got way more assets in their 50s as they get closer to retirement. And so obviously we're hearing now on the right, Andrew Tate is discouraging men from getting married. He says he's focused on making a lot of money, but he doesn't acknowledge that for the average guy, he's way more likely to earn more, accumulate more assets, and just to be in a better spot financially. Healthier, live longer, 9 years longer.
Satisfaction,
more sex on average than a married, guys. So for the average guy, getting married is linked to greater financial success, greater emotional well-being, and better health.
I got just a funny anecdote here, lest we sit back and we're only railing on the public universities. Chris Lightfoot, who leads our Church Ambassador Network, shared a story this morning with us about a college president who we've been president of a Christian university here in Ohio, who has seen the Hope and a Future report and is feeling really convicted about, okay, we got to go all in on creating a marriage and family culture. And he shared with Chris that after he sort of interacted with the report and all this kind of stuff, he emailed their provost to say, hey, when was the last time our Christian university taught a marriage and family class? And they said 2008. Wow. Right? I mean, that is, again, that's just one of those subtle messages of that we have, that even as the church, we've bought into what is life about, right? Yeah. And so we abandoned the marriage and family class to add in, maybe an economic class that was really good or something like that. But in terms of what's actually forming that person, that young adult for the future to make good, healthy choices. Again, this is, learning, one more English lit class is not going to have the long-term benefits of that student as really valuing marriage and family.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, too, just with the way that we approach marriage, even those of us who are pro-marriage, that we hear of a young couple that wants to get married, and there's that instinct of, you're too young for that. Right, what are you doing? But that's sort of even on the positive side of marriage, society has changed from this is something that you do together. You kind of arrive and go on the journey together before arriving to now saying, you've got to arrive before you can get married. Like, you've got to check all of these boxes. And to a degree with the success sequence, that's true. But to just say that you've got to be in your 30s and have your career established and all that before you get married, you're missing out on a lot of those benefits that marriage has.
Success sequence, all we're saying when it comes to education, right, is just you've got to get that high school degree, right?
Right.
And so that's a pretty basic expectation. Yeah. So I mean, I would definitely say, and again, it depends upon meeting like the right person, right? But I would say, like, if you've met, a good person who is a great friend and there's that connection, then getting married in your 20s is a wonderful thing.
So let's get into the success sequence, because I think that's the good news in all this, right? We're not saying that to be successful here, you got to jump through a million hoops, right? What is the success sequence? I think a lot of people have no clue what it is. We need to know what it is, because it is pretty much that's the answer in a nutshell. Even as I was reading the scripture, I can hear some of the success sequence just echoing the words of God. But go ahead. Right.
So it's classically defined as getting just a high school degree, working full-time in your 20s, and getting married before having any children, okay? And the idea there is if you kind of do those three things, your odds of being poor, again, are just 3% in your late 20s and 30s. This is kind of when we did our analysis, my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, and I. And then your odds of being in the middle class or higher, 86%. Then Dr. Wang has just done some newer work showing, too, that young adults who kind of follow the sequence are a lot less likely to be emotionally distressed. They're just in a better place emotionally once they have those kind of three ducks in a row, if you will. And they also have markedly higher stable families than their peers who haven't followed the sequence. I should say that. It's about 4 times. So the point is that the sequence is linked to greater economic success, greater emotional well-being, and to more family stability for young adults. That's a big deal. So I think, but no, the only thing I would sort of add, though, I think, in terms of the education piece, I would sort of say to young adults, and I've got a big family, I've got 9 kids. Not all of my kids are going to graduate from college. Not all of them are going to go to college. But I do think, and this is what I tell my own kids, so I would say it to everyone basically, I think encouraging your kids who are not in the college track to get some kind of skill that sets you apart in the contemporary labor market. So maybe it's an IT certification, maybe it's being an EMT, maybe it's being a plumber, maybe it's being, someone who works with, an MRI, something that kind of allows you to have a little bit more of but this is something that can be done in a year or two, oftentimes in a trade school or in a hospital or, some other things. So just to kind of encourage young adults, to realize that there is some degree of education that they should get, to sort of launch them successfully. But they don't need to have a master's or a PhD to kind of, realize the American dream would be the educational point.
So, Brad, we're coming up on time here, but I did want to. Last week on the narrative, we talked a lot about the governor's refundable child tax credit that he brought forward, and one of the things that we talked about, is that how we would love to see like a marriage bonus or something like that added onto it. However, I saw an X post from you earlier today, because there is, I think there's a lot of creative thinking going on right now about how do we encourage more marriage, and more so than I've ever seen. However, and a lot of times where we look to for these things is where it seems to be getting really pressing the line on it in an exciting way in some ways. Is Hungary, right? And Viktor Orban came out today and said any mother that has 2 or more kids does not have to pay income tax. And you had some concerns about that. What's the problem with, from your perspective, what's the problem with some of these policies that are just tied to children alone or things like that?
Well, I think that, we're kind of in an exciting moment, Aaron, where I think we're beginning to understand that, family policy matters, that we should be trying to sort of structure a public policy in ways to strengthen family life. And that kind of the classic Republican idea, you just kind of cut taxes and cut regulations and look for growth is the answer to every single problem in our, in our country. That I think that mindset is, basically over and done with. Like, we realize that as some of our core institutions are really faltering, like marriage and family, we need to sort of rethink, both the cultural and the economic incentives to strengthen those institutions. But you also have to have some humility here and recognize that, we've done a lot of things over the last 60 years that were designed to help families. I mean, whatever you might think of, Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and their advisors, I think there was a certain kind of sincerity there. They were trying to inaugurate bold new policies that they thought would help families across the country, that would eliminate poverty or minimize poverty across the country. And both, Kennedy and Johnson, for instance, had a lot of rhetoric about kind of, sort of extolling the family and extolling personal responsibility. But just the way that all rolled out, I think, unintentionally led to a lot of, mistakes and problems that we've all kind of now, I think, seen in retrospect. So I'm just saying that I think as we look at, what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary, what others are proposing, here in the U.S. to kind of do to strengthen families, just need to kind of like have a certain measure of humility and seriousness. We're just kind of trying to game out, is this policy going to have the intended effect? Are there ways in which it could lead to unintended consequences? Does it tend to reinforce, work in our country? Does it tend to reinforce marriage in our country? Does it allow parents to maximize their opportunities to spend time with their kids? And so I think a lot of policies that are kind of trotted out as being pro-family, for instance, like child care subsidies.
I was going to ask you exactly that.
Are actually measures that end up leading parents, for instance, to spend less time with their kids. So from my position, if someone wants to see family function strengthen, to see the bonds between parents and their kids, between parents and one another, that is the couple, have those bonds strengthen, I think we don't want to be getting behind policies that actually have the effect of decreasing the time and money and the authority of parents rather than increasing them.
I gotta just drill in on this one real quick, because this is the childcare one is one of these things where worldview really, really matters, right? And it kind of reminded me of, as you were talking, Brad, it reminded me of J.D. Vance's comments he just made at CPAC about, and he was talking about COVID, but, and about where, like, the worst thing, if you're not a Christian, the worst thing in the world is death, right? And I think this is one of these areas where worldview matters a lot too, because in, as we're talking about what are the best policies for encouraging marriage and family, a lot of times what we're trying to think of is how do we relieve the stress of raising kids off of parents, right? And so we say, oh, well, childcare is going to be one of those things, more childcare or free childcare is going to be one of those things that's going to relieve the stress of parents. Well, actually, again, as Brad shows, what's the best thing for that kid is being with mom and dad, right? Or mom or dad, right? But mom and dad are married. And second, to build on that, like, who are the happiest people, right? It's the people that are married with kids that they're raising. Now, that's kind of counterintuitive in our culture, because anybody who has raised a child or multiple children will tell you it's very frustrating at times, right? It's very painful at times. It's hard at times. But that ultimately, those are the happiest people, the most joyful people. And so a lot of times what we end up trying to do is saying, how do we minimize pain behind these policies? And what we're doing is actually in those pain, in that struggle, is where joy and happiness is actually found. That's a worldview thing right there, right? That's not necessarily a public policy thing, but that's where public policy that's built upon a faulty worldview, which is to say anything that's painful or stressful, we need to try to do our best to minimize. It's ultimately not going to achieve the results that we want.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I would just say my wife and I had this conversation, 6 years ago or so, where she was in the workforce and just feeling all kinds of stress because she didn't think she was doing a good job at work, didn't think she was doing a good job at home, and couldn't figure out what she wanted to do. And I was like, if you want to come home, come home. But it was a tough place for me to get to because of all that cultural pressure of, well, if you don't let your wife have her own career, you're just a misogynist jerk and all that. And I might be a misogynist jerk.
You gotta have it.
But it's out there. It's in the water, and it's really tough to push back against if you're not thinking through
these conversations. Sometimes I wonder what God must must be feeling. Because, it's like sitting around the kitchen table and your kids are talking about something they just learned, and they act like it's the first time somebody ever told them. And I'm like, God must just be sitting up there like, I told y'all this. This is what I've been trying to tell you. But the scripture says, "My people fail to praise me, I will cause the very rocks to cry out." So thank you for your work and showing us how the social sciences is really just confirming everything that God said from the beginning.
Amen. Amen. Well, ccv.org/hope is where you can learn more about the report. You can get a full copy of it. You can check out the Family Index at ccv.org/family index. And I just want to say, too, read this full report. I know it seems like it can be dense, but Brad, you did a great job of making this accessible, and you can follow the narrative of the research very easily through this report. So thank you for this work. I know it's going to make a difference here in Ohio. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Westler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.